All right, and joining us on the EU vax mandate conversation is former UK MP George Galloway. And George Szamuely, he's a writer and senior fellow at the Global Policy Institute in London. So George, Galloway, I should say, going to you first. Austria has become the first country in the EU to impose compulsory COVID vaccines. They are about a week into the latest lockdown that can last up to 20 days. However, George, the caveat to this lockdown is that it's only for the unvaccinated. What do you make of these different laws based on someone's medical status?
Well, it's said that Austria's greatest achievement was to persuade the world that Beethoven was Austrian and Hitler was German. The tyranny still has an echo in the streets of Austria, and it's not a pretty sight. The idea that people who refuse or are not able to get vaccinated should be walled off in this tyrannical way is repugnant and unfortunately catching. It's quite likely that this attitude will spread, not least to Germany, which was, of course, twinned with Austria in former tyrannical times.
And George Szamuely, Olaf Scholz is set to take the helm in Germany as chancellor next week. He's already expressed support for vaccine mandates and a mishmash of other COVID policies across Germany. Now, if Germany adopts a compulsory vaccine policy, will that be the tipping point for the other EU states to follow suit?
I think that's quite likely. I mean, to a certain extent, this is already true for a number of EU states. I mean, Italy is already quite close to it, so you'd have to think Italy will probably be next on the agenda. But I think Germany is almost certain that Germany will go down that path. We already had a joint op-ed written by the prime ministers of Bavaria and Baden-Württemberg advocating a vaccine mandate. So, I mean, the German attitude will be, well, hey, if the Austrians can go down the path of fascism, we're going to one-up the Austrians. So, yeah, I'm sure that's coming.
Now, George Galloway, going back to Austria, it's been gravely underreported, I would say, the massive numbers of anti-lockdown, anti-vaccine mandate protests that have taken place in Austria. We're talking 40,000 demonstrators in each march. I'd like your thoughts on two things for this. Why the lack of reporting on these marches? They're comparable to the size of the Yellow Vest marches. And second, will they have any impact on Vienna's policies?
Well, a very good analogy. In fact, the Yellow Vests were roughly the same number and equally ignored by the mainstream media. There have been massive demonstrations outside the BBC's headquarters. All they had to do was point a camera out the window, but they didn't, because we are, of course, in the teeth of a gale of propaganda, of Project Fear, hysteria. A good example in your own show so far. South African variant turns out to be a Netherlands variant. The people who identified it in South Africa say that we're all overreacting to it. Other scientists are saying that Omicron might actually be a good break for us because it might conquer the Delta variant whilst being less deadly than the Delta variant. I'm a person who's been double vaccinated and I'm waiting for my booster. I'm not against vaccination, but I'd have to concede that the vaccine hasn't turned out to be all that it was cracked up to be, because it's not really stopping people. You get triple vaccinated people passing the thing on to other triple vaccinated people. So the credibility of the vaccination, and particularly forced vaccination, which is redolent, I'm sorry to labor the point, of the Hitlerite past, is something that is beyond the pale for me.
Right. We should also note that as much as Americans like to down on Vladimir Putin, he was actually the first world leader to speak up and say, I am not going to force vaccinate my entire population. I encourage it, but I'm not going to force my people to do it. Everyone should do it. Everyone should get it. It's free, but we're not going to force anybody in Russia. George Szamuely, what's the rationale for such severe measures in Austria and perhaps upcoming in Germany when the numbers show that less than 0.5% per 100,000 people in Austria were infected with COVID last week and around 1% infected in Germany per 100,000?
There's no rationale. It's entirely a matter of our political elites. They've gone down this path, and they have they lack the imagination to think of some different route. And so it was always inevitable, as soon as the cold weather comes, which is the influenza season, then the number of cases of COVID would rise. But everything that we've known from COVID from the beginning is true, which is that the overwhelming majority of the public makes a full recovery from COVID, with the exception of people who either have underlying health conditions or are over the age of 65 or over the age of 70. But the overwhelming majority of people make a full recovery. And now with these vaccines, which as George pointed out, was all the huge promise of the vaccine will be able to get back to life as normal. Well, it's not happening. And now, there's now the booster shot, so that's a third shot. And we've already been told that the vaccine is only good for 4 months. Well, if the virus keeps mutating, then it's a good bet that we're going to need another booster shot in 3 months, and then in 2 months, and then in 1 month, and then in a week. And so essentially, we're just going to be forced to pump chemicals into our bodies without any knowledge of where all this is going and what the long-term health effects of these are. What effect is this going to have on fertility? What effect is this going to have on one's innate immunity system? And that's it. And the politicians are just going down this path. Yes, give more and more and more of this vaccination. And anyone who doesn't go along with it gets punished as the Austrians are doing.
Yeah, talk about just a few weeks ago, we were discussing the report out of the EU about democracy in decline. Add these to the list. George Galloway and George Szamuely, thank you both for weighing in.